So we are good to begin now.
Sure.
Good afternoon. I am Dr. Karthikeya Prakasam, the Associate Dean for the School of Commerce, Finance and Accountancy. I'm very happy for the School of Commerce, Finance and is very happy to extend a warm welcome to all the dignitaries and audiences present in the platform for the inauguration and commencement of Dr. Manmohan Singh Memorial Lecture Series. First of all, I would like to extend a warm welcome to the key officials of the university, the Vice Chancellor, Father Dr. Jose C.C., the Pro Vice Chancellor, Father Dr. Viju P. Devasi, the Chief Finance Officer, Father Dr. Verghese K.J., and the other members of the Christ administration for their constant support and encouragement. Dr. Manmohan Singh Memorial Lecture Series is an initiative of the Christ University School of Commerce, Finance, Accountancy Club, headed by Professor Rishikesh and supported by Professor Krishna Prasad and Dr. Priya J. This lecture series is a tribute to Dr. Manmohan Singh, a renowned Indian economist, statesman, and academician for transforming India's economy and placing it on a path for globalization and growth. His legacy endures as a symbol of integrity, scholarship, and transformative leadership. And this knowledge-sharing session will add significant value to each one of us present here. On this occasion, I'm happy to welcome our chief guest, Dr. Arvind Virmani, member Niti Aayog, former executive director, International Monetary Fund, former economic advisor, Government of India, and today sir will be delivering on the topic India's economic reforms, lessons and the road ahead. A warm welcome to you, sir. To facilitate this discussion, we have a vibrant moderator, Dr. Subhashri Acharya, from the Department of Professional Studies. A warm welcome to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, sir.
A hearty welcome to Dr. Tommy K. Kallarikal, the Dean, School of Commerce, Finance and Accountancy. Sir is a source of inspiration and a constant support in all our endeavors. A warm welcome to you, sir. A cordial welcome to Dr. Viju Toms, the Director, School of Commerce, Finance and Accountancy. Sir is known for his innovation in the academia and social extension projects, which he has taken up. Warm welcome to you, sir. I welcome Dr. Amalnathan S. and Professor Samya V., the heads of the Department of Commerce and Department of Professional Studies, for their unwavering support and their presence in this session. I wholeheartedly welcome the CUSCFA coordinators, Professor Rishikesh, Krishna Prasad, and Priya J. for their support and involvement in this new initiative. A hearty welcome to all the faculty members from both the departments, and I'm also equally happy to welcome all the students from the university who has joined to witness this lecture series. Last but not least, I welcome all the participants and the audiences present in this platform who have joined to witness this great interaction with our guest, Dr. Arvind Virmani. I welcome you all once again. Thank you. Now I hand it over to Dr. Subhashri Acharya for moderating this session.
Thank you so much, sir. India has come a long way from Bharatakhanda to Aryavarta to India to Bharat. Our Bharat has witnessed transformations. In 1991, India embarked on a bold journey of transformation, breaking free from the shackles of a closed socialist economy. This was not merely a policy shift, it was a revolution. The path of liberalization, privatization, and globalization, known as the LPG model, ignited a new era of progress and prosperity. Liberalization allowed us to dismantle rigidity, ushering in entrepreneurial spirit and welcoming innovation and efficiency. Globalization opened India's doors to the world, bringing in investments, technology, and global partnerships that elevated our stature on the international stage. Acknowledging the contributions of late Dr. Manmohan Singh, in whose memory we have this lecture series today, we're joined by another stalwart whose service and contributions are shaping India into a robust economy. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to welcome and introduce our guest, Dr. Arvind Virmani, member Niti Aayog. Dr. Veermani is a distinguished Indian economist who has significantly contributed to India's economic policy and planning and has held several pivotal positions in both national and international economic institutions. It is inspiring and motivating to read Sir's distinguishing profile. Sir earned his doctoral degree in economics from Harvard University under the mentorship of Nobel laureate Kenneth Arrow in 1975. After completing his doctorate, Dr. Veermani taught at New York University before returning to India in 1977. He joined the World Bank as a senior economist, serving for nearly a decade. In 1987, he began his tenure with the Indian government, holding senior roles in the Finance Ministry and the Planning Commission. Notably, he served as the chief economic advisor to the Government of India from 2007 to 2009, during which he authored the Economic Survey of India. In 2009, he was appointed as India's representative to the International Monetary Fund. Dr. Veermani has also been associated with various financial institutions, including serving on the boards of the Export-Import Bank of India, Life Insurance Corporation of India, Punjab National Bank, and Allahabad Bank. Sir is the founder of Foundation for Economic Growth and Welfare, EGROW, a public policy organization focused on macroeconomic policy, public welfare, national security, and diplomacy. On November 16, 2022, Dr. Veermani was appointed as a full-time member of Niti Aayog, India's premier policy think tank. Sir has several contributions which directly affect us. Attempting to compile Sir's contribution in a paragraph may not do justice, yet I make an attempt to compile them. His contributions, especially in regard to income tax reforms, enabled simplification of personal income tax rate to a 3-slab system with the highest slab of 30% and fewer exemptions. He also enabled foreign exchange reform, a move from controlled and managed foreign exchange system to a dual exchange rate, and from there to an integrated but managed exchange rate. Replacement of the existing laws by a comprehensive new Foreign Exchange Management Act. Pacing of private entry with regulatory system improvement and balancing competition against asymmetric information and moral hazard problems has been his contribution in the area of banking and capital markets. Sir has also played a pivotal role in macro management advice on India's balance of payment crisis, Latin American crisis, Asian crisis, nuclear-related sanctions, and global financial crisis. We are immensely honored to have a personality of this stature whose contribution in transitioning India from a fragile to a robust economy through a series of policy reforms and initiatives. Sir, we are eager to hear from you about your perspectives on India's economic reforms, lessons, and the road ahead. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Prakasam and Dr. Acharya, for your kind words. So, given the time constraint and given my academic habit of talking too much, I will straight away start on my lecture. Can you?
Yes, sir.
I hope you can see the slide. Hello? Yeah. Okay. I'm going to, the topic has been announced. I'm going to really talk about 3 aspects. First, I'll start very quickly with reflections on policy reform for the years, some of the years where I overlap with Dr. Manmohan Singh, to give you an idea of the professional interaction under his leadership and support, which I was involved in. The main part of my talk will be kind of a capsule history of Indian economic policy. Obviously, given the forum and the time, we don't have time to go into everything, but I will talk about the 5 phases of reform and the broad themes of these reforms, different policy changes at different times, etc., and then links between policy reform and growth. So that is the main purpose of my talk. And then at the end, I will draw some lessons from policy reform. So first, some professional reflections on the reforms where I was directly under Dr. Manmohan Singh. Of course, his support was absolutely essential to that. So first, my first kind of work with him was in the Planning Commission, where he hired me in late 1979, 1980. And fortunately or unfortunately, we overlapped for 3 years, from 80 to 82, after which he was appointed RBI governor and left. But the policy reform ideas, etc., which I wanted to talk about, I wrote 5 notes during that period. So those continue. And the underlying approach, which was very important for later reforms, was to work out for India principles which we had seen worked in many other countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, which included market competition, subject to externalities, issues of government, public goods, and maximization of public welfare. I mean, these are very technical things, but I just wanted to put down that the reforms which were initiated had all this background of thought, etc. Then, when he became finance minister and remained there for 6 years, 91 to 96, we again, in fact, before his appointment, the small story, I met him at a party like a week before his appointment as finance minister. Of course, I had no idea that he would become finance minister. And he asked me, well, what about reforms? Of course, I had interacted with him for many years before that. So I thought he was just doing routinely asking me, what do you think we should do? I had no idea that he would become finance minister. Anyway, I recall sending him an email, a 2-page email, in which I again reiterated some of the ideas we had learned. And then after moving to the finance ministry, where he brought me, we did the dual exchange rate, etc., which the Professor Acharya has already mentioned. Trade liberalization was a very important part of how to determine the phasing. Some of you, many of you may not know that we had tariffs as high as 300%. So in some sense, it was frightening to say, okay, if we bring them down to, let's say, 50% or 25%, what will happen to the economy? So thinking about it, the phasing it was a very critical part of these reforms, which I participated in. And the whole idea of interaction between trade liberalization and reform. So that's just a kind of flavor of the kind of things which I was professionally involved in under his leadership. And then very briefly, on his stint as Prime Minister from 2004 to 2009, on part of this, where I was outside the government, heading a think tank, but from 6, 7 to 9, the things which I worked on, was things like UID, the unique ID, which we'll say a little bit more of later, the whole issue of the reform of government services, and the VAT, which led to the GST. So that is a flavor of the kind of professional work which I was personally involved with, you could say, under his Dr. Manmohan Singh's leadership. Okay, so my the main part of my talk relates to the phases of reform. So very briefly, what I have on the left is a table showing various things. I'll read out the critical elements of this, which is the performance under the 3 phases. The first phase was 61 to 80. Second phase is 81 to 91. Third phase from 92 to 2003. Fourth from 2004 to 13. And the last phase, which is current, from 14 onwards. Now, one of the most interesting things is that we have progressively moved. In phase 1, our performance in terms of per capita GDP was in the bottom 20% of the world economy, of all the countries in the world for which we have data. In phase 2, we moved to top 20%. So big change from phase 1 to phase 2. This is something which most people do not realize, but it is important for students like those of your university, Christ University, to know that this was a big change. I'll talk a little more of each of these phases. Then in phase 3, from 92 to 2003, which is the reforms which are associated most closely with Dr. Manmohan Singh, but we must remember that Prime Minister Narasimha Rao had a very, very important role in leading as Prime Minister the reform, because no reform happened unless the very top leadership is fully behind them or fully leading in that sense the effort. So in phase 3, we moved to the top 10 to 15%, and phase 4, little change happened. So we've more or less remained at the same level. This is another thing which is not very well appreciated, and I'll say a bit more about that. And then finally, in phase 5, which is the current phase, as I mentioned, we moved to the top 5% of the performers in terms of per capita GDP growth. So, sorry, going backward. So, so phase 1, which the Professor Acharya has quite nicely outlined, was the kind of a stagnation. I told you our growth was in the bottom 20% of the world economy. So policy regimes, we won't go into details, but the professed goal was a mixed economy. The reality was a jungle of controls on every aspect of the economy, and basically producing the worst control regime among market democracies of the world. Economic outcome, average percent year per capita GDP grew by only 1 to 1.3%, less than, and GDP between 3.5 and 4%. Bottom quintile of all countries, which I just pointed out to you. Poverty actually increased during this period. And this is World Bank data, not my data or Indian data, which shows this very clearly. Amazing that we were growing so slowly that poverty was actually increasing because the population was rising. And the worst thing about this was the long-term damage in terms of tax evasion and corruption, which became a systemic problem. The decontrol, this is a period where I mentioned we had decontrol, but we also had some opposite movement, which is why many scholars don't appreciate what happened here. So it was basically selective decontrol. It's kind of like a pressure cooker where you bottled everything up, you start releasing the air, the pressure goes down. So there was selective decontrol of the external trade, production, etc. But the amazing thing is the per capita GDP growth rose to 2.9% from that 1.2, 1.3 range, which is 2.5 times what it was in the socialist period. Okay, so great move, and the growth rate moved to the top, from the bottom to the top. So in that sense, it was an important pre-setting to the 91 reforms. Poverty for the first time again began to decline rather than increasing. Again, World Bank data. And it turns out that capital goods import, there's a research which I have done when I was heading the think tank, and it showed that the decontrol of the import system was very important. Again, I think it's important to note these things. We don't have time to go over each of these. There's such a, that's why I call it a capsule history. So certain policies continued on socialist trajectory. For example, marginal income tax rate rose to 90%, 95%, and 100% if you include the wealth tax. So this is the reason why people don't really appreciate that this pressure cooker reform in a way was very important for setting the growth stage for the subsequent very comprehensive reforms. So some of these numbers I've pointed out to you. We will just leave this here so people can see for themselves. And let me say, this is all data based on World WDI, World Bank indicators. So we don't get into controversies about, our own data system and so on, which is pretty good, but I avoided that to not get into the. So we come to the liberalization phase, 91 to 2003. I kind of think of this in terms of two sub phases. The first one, so I don't like to do economic analysis in terms of political, changes, but political changes do affect how things happen. So I kind of try to combine the two. So I think of P3 liberalization from 91 to 2003 with a sub phase which is associated with PV Narasimha Rao and the Manmohan Singh, but things happened even after they remitted office in 96. So basically the focus of this liberalization, which was initiated by Dr. PVNR and MMS, was on the manufacturing system, price, production, and capacity. Internal trade was liberalized. Investment, private, domestic, and foreign FDI started to be liberalized quite significantly. You see the big thrust in terms of political opposition, intellectual opposition comes in the initial change. So one has to give credit, quite rightly, as Professor Acharya has said also, that the FDI liberalization was very important. It didn't all happen, but the start was so difficult. And I remember that being in so many discussions and writing papers about it. It was very difficult, this foreign FDI liberalization part. Similarly, the capital market and foreign FII, ECB was liberalized. So in all these discussions, I was personally present in the finance ministry when we had these discussions and know how difficult it was to make these decisions. External trade, exchange rate, again, has been mentioned. So we went from the dual rate to the uniform rate to market-driven to FEMA. So in that whole chain, of course, I wrote many papers which became the basis of this reform. And then bank and equity market, lots of people were involved in that. And my personal involvement really was one of the core people in the finance ministry who was familiar with the economics of financial sector, etc. But the credit goes to a whole bunch of financial sector people outside the finance ministry, which Dr. Manmohan Singh and so on, the Secretary DA used, interacted with, etc. And something which happened after Dr. Manmohan Singh remitted office, the personal income tax reform. But it is part of this. The second part of this was, you could say, roughly in the Atal Bihari Vajpayee administration, perhaps had some origins before also, but the whole structure of public goods infrastructure was put in place very consciously, distinguishing between public goods infrastructure and private goods infrastructure, the issues of monopoly and how to introduce private investment and competition, privatization of consumer goods services. The first case happened during this period, and again, that required going against a huge amount of political resistance. The public goods versus private goods infrastructure. What is that? Basically, things like airports, ports, electricity distribution are public goods infrastructure. Mobile telephony, power production, airlines. So the conceptual basis for all this was firmly entrenched into the reform process, where things like construction of highways is not a highway. So they are quite different. They had to be conceptually separated out and a different policy adopted towards these. So all this happened during this second phase. The new telecom policy, free private entry, but regulated. So devising a regulated system took a lot of time, but that was critical to having a kind of good competition, so to say, which benefited everybody. And we know the results of that. The Electricity Act. Again, conceptually, we knew what needed to be done, but the actual unbundling of production, distribution, transmission, they had to be separated out and dealt with separately. So all that was the reforms in the second phase, as I said, of P3. the last one where again I was associated very closely. I was member secretary of the FDI committee, where for the first time it was proposed to have 100% FDI even in defense, and we made a logical defense of that. Unfortunately, after that, the government changed, and some of those things took a long time to carry out. So, but what was the outcome of this P3 liberalization of all the reforms I mentioned? So, per capita average annual growth increased from 4%, rather increased from to 4% from 2.9% in the earlier phase, which is roughly 1.4 times that. And we moved to the top 15% of all countries. So that is the outcome of this liberalization. Similarly, even in GDP growth, we went from about 5.3% average to 6%, and reached that performance was took us to the top 15% of countries. And poverty declined rapidly with faster growth. This is an important lesson which people tend to forget. So some of the lessons which I did a lot of research on this at that time. So some of the lessons from this research were there is a lag between reforms and GDP acceleration. And the bigger the reform, there is something called the J curve of growth and productivity for major reforms. This is a paper one published when I was at IMF. The incremental effects of reform decrease at higher rates. There's a table which shows some of these things, which will be next, but these are the important lessons which we must, and we need continuous reforms to maintain GDP growth at 7%. This is a very important lesson which was soon forgotten. And again, I will show you where the actual thing happened. So we moved to the P4 decade, 4 to 14, the fourth phase of reforms, if you want to call it. But the reform momentum flagged. However, given the previous reforms, and the lagged effects, the J curve, which I mentioned to you, the growth rate of per capita income actually increased from 4% to 5.3%. Now, this is often taken to mean that there were a lot of reforms in this decade. Then why do we call it a lost decade? I'll show you some of the things. The objective during this period, the primacy of social goals, but no social sector reforms. So the social goals were thought to be met by just increasing expenditure without really going deep into it. So, somewhat simplistic things saying our expenditure on health or education is low relative to many other countries, so we must increase it. So I must be frank here. I actually oppose this kind of approach, and I wrote, I did a review of the sectors which actually showed what the social sector reforms should be, rather than just thinking of expenditures. Anyway, and the second outcome of this was some kind of excess credit by forced infrastructure loans, which resulted in what is called the twin debt problem. Fiscal looseness, even though FRBM 2003 was passed during the earlier phase, it was suspended after the global financial crisis of 8-9 and virtually abandoned in 2010. So I'm just giving you an idea of why it is called the lost decade. And one is not detracting from the fact that the growth rate accelerated. That is there. It's on the top line. But these were some of the weaknesses why we call it a lost decade. And I'll show you at the end a final graph which brings it out. But there was reforms. Let's not be chary of that. So one of the most important was the UID creation, which is the unique ID number, which later on became the Aadhaar. So again, I can talk personally because I wrote the paper in 2006. I carried it through the Planning Commission, and finally, in an interministerial committee, we approved this thing. But however, in 2009, we approved it, but it got gridlocked in cabinet. So things didn't happen till the next phase of the reforms. Similarly, the job skills, the importance of job skills was recognized. We created what is called the National Skill Development Corporation. But again, the whole process got kind of gridlocked in center state thing. So similarly for SENVAT into a national VAT, which is now called the GST, what similarly gridlocked. So there were some thoughts, some initiations, but the results were not there, and most of the growth came from the momentum from the previous reforms. And I can tell you that as CA, when I left, I retired in 2009 as CA, I warned of the need for reforms for sustaining growth. That was my personal warning. I still remember, in fact, I think OECD had asked us to do a paper, which we did, in which this warning was also presented. I gave it in interviews, my going away interviews to the media. Okay, so we come to the final phase of liberalization, 2014 to 25. I again divided it into two phases, one from 14 to 19 and the other from 2020, because that's when COVID happened. So COVID affected many, many things which we still don't understand and appreciate generally. So I'm going to say a bit more about that. So the macroeconomic reforms was the initial thing to stabilize, given that we had a kind of a small BOP crisis in 2013. Institutional reforms. So the India Bankruptcy Code, which is very, very important, perhaps one of the most important institutional reforms, what I call a bad debt problem, and to deal with bad debt problem, the Monetary Policy Committee, another institutional reform. You know, we have been talking a lot about the policy reforms, but the attention in this sense changed to more to institutional reform, which we had not addressed. You may recall the first or second slide where I mentioned that the focus was on liberalizing the manufacturing system, etc. So Monetary Policy Committee to introduce flexible inflation targeting, the goods and service tax, one of the first, actually the biggest constitutional amendment relating to the economic matters. There have been many political amendments, but this was a major constitutional amendment. That is why this is so important. There were, of course, weaknesses because all the states, given that it had to be a constitutional amendment, all the states had to come on board and participate. So the result of which was multiple rates, lots of cesses, etc. The other reforms during this period related to natural resources, oil, coal, mineral spectrum. So the economic concepts of how to lease or through auctions was finally implemented. Please don't get me wrong. These were not all ideas which were created during this period. But what matters in reforms is when it actually happened. Well, there are two stages. One is the approval and second is the implementation. Ideas in a policy framework have no meaning unless somebody takes them up. And again, I'm talking from my personal experience. Much of my time was spent in thinking of devising timing and phasing how to get things through the system. Okay, so that becomes a very important part. You know, people outside think if it's a great idea, I know it's a great idea, why isn't anybody doing it? Well, you have to get it through the system. There is a whole system of doing these things. Okay, so natural resources, corporate tax reform in the end of this period. But again, there are always unintended consequences, indirect effects. So one of the things was that the goal shifted from, so initially the growth focus was there, but then moral, social issues like anti-corruption laws, demonetization also came into the picture, which were in a way driven by something beyond pure economics or market economics, you can call it. So again, I examined this thing, and you may recall I said that I wrote an IMF paper, which was the J curve of policy reforms, similar sort of things begin to happen when you do major institutional reforms. So even IBC, which is a huge and very good thing for the long term, had short-term costs. So we should be aware of these. People who suggest reforms, etc., have to deal with these also. GST, again, because it was a constitutional amendment, compromises were made. This happens. Okay, in practice, you have to take account of these. Similarly, MPC, though long term it was a very good thing, there were big forecasting errors in the initial period, which led to very high real rates. Okay, so there are always these learning effects, particularly in large changes. So slow resolution of legacy problems because of all this focus of RBI on MPC, etc., and other factors. There are lots of factors. We don't have time. And then things like Make in India initially had a protective bias in the tariff rates, which gradually has been adjusted. So there's a figure somewhere. So the impact of some of these things were not up to expectation in terms of reform credibility, market confidence, investment, and GDP growth trends. So in any reform, there are always good things, but there are also unintended consequences, which good reformers have to take preemptive action. The better you anticipate indirect effects, the better the reforms are, because you can put the things in place. This is just showing the import tariffs. I think we're taking time. So let me move to the final, just a list of some of the things which were done during this institutional phase. Digital India, Green India, you're all familiar with. The e-governance, GEM, UPI, which was there. A big emphasis on tech startups and modern quality job. This is a big mental change. We've always thought of small as micro and small, okay? But this startups, these are the new things. These are the things which will drive technological change also. They are not just small and micro, but they adopt modern tech, modern management. As you all know, the informal sector in India constitutes roughly 85% of the whole economy. That is kind of a kind of low-level quality chain, and this has to be taken to high-quality chain. So part of it will be the legacy small industries moving up, but much of it for the future will be these startups, okay, which will drive this new type of growth, more skill intensive, more jobs for better skilled people. And then there's the solar adoption was a big change. There was huge resistance to accepting any environmental goals, but this government decided that if we grab this opportunity and take the positives, rather than just looking at the negative part. So a change in approach to emphasize, not focus too much on the negative effects, but to see, okay, what are the positive effects we can. And the outcome of this is that per capita GDP growth accelerated to 5.6% and raised our ranking in the world to the top 3%. So despite all these indirect negative effects, etc., you may call it, our relative position in the world improved. And GDP growth stabilized. All these graphs are there, which people want to see at leisure, because I can't go through line by line. But let me kind of summarize. So average per capita GDP accelerated with reforms till 2019. This is the year before the COVID. A steady rise relative to world average. India's growth rank also improved progressively from bottom 20% to top 4%. COVID shock has reduced average growth by about a bit more than a point. And this loss of GDP some of it has been made up with the above trend growth subsequent to COVID. But again, one of the lessons which we learn is that this may require greater reform effort than we had anticipated in 2019-20. So these shocks happen. This is just a graph showing how this has turned the COVID shock has kind of, so our relative growth was rising from 1980, but the rate of acceleration has kind of has stabilized because of various shocks which I mentioned here. And again, the conclusion is that reforms have to be pursued with vigor to ensure 7% or higher GDP growth. We cannot rest on our laurels. Very quickly, let me speed up a bit, otherwise we'll run out of time. So the phase 2 in 2019, the most significant set of reforms in 1990s, commitment to and spirit of reform. So in some sense, this is, you could see it as a continuous progression of clearer thinking, right approach, etc. And some things are done because whatever is reform is done has to be also sensitive to political. So commitment to spirit of reform was clearly there. Change in philosophy, approach, and attitude. Again, Madam, the chair mentioned this. Even clearer conceptualization, moving from kind of the communist socialist ideology to a market economy and a modern welfare democracy. Okay, so it is not capitalism, which is the theoretical concept of the Marxists. It is practical. It is in a modern welfare democracy. It is not a so key role for entrepreneurs and job creators, openness to practical information and knowledge, not just theory, but theory is also important, and institutional reform to complement policy reform. And the bottom line, government not as director and doer of everything, but as a facilitator. So these conceptual changes happen, and some of these reforms I will quickly mention. The comprehensive and systematic effort in 2020 to liberalize the production of service sectors. These are all gaps which were left in the, again, refer back to the 90s reforms under Narasimha Rao and Dr. Manmohan Singh. So at that time, we didn't feel that we had the political space or the risk-taking ability till we did the manufacturing, financial, etc. So these were deliberately left out. We didn't feel we can address it. Not that we didn't know that these things like agriculture had to be done. So space, atomic energy, BPO liberalization, drones, geo-mapping, you may think of these as little things, but they are very important. So they have to be systematically found and liberalized. Remember that expression, jungle of controls, which happened in the pre-80 period? That has created all these things which are lying somewhere hidden. They have to be brought out and liberalized. Factor markets. Again, this is something we knew about right from the beginning, but we didn't think we had the political support or the public knowledge and understanding to do. So some of that has been done, not everything. IBC, labor codes, bad banks, some of these are still in process, not completed. Public sector, the issue of privatization, very new. Again, huge resistance we had anticipated at that time. It's finally being thought of and initiated. And ease of cost of doing business, etc. You all know. And a modern welfare system. This is what is deliberately, the communist socialists deliberately ignore that India's system focuses on both its own type of Indian characteristic, Antodaya, and empowerment of every socio-economic group. This is not like what happens in Europe, and it's far, far from what happens in USA. In fact, for those who are interested, I have a working paper which outlines the Indian approach and shows you how it compares with the European and American. It's on our NITI website. So here is the bottom line. What I have done here is from 2000 to 2023, based on international data, I have taken the GDP growth rank. I've done it for per capita. I think this is per capita GDP, if I'm not mistaken. I should have checked. Yeah. So our per capita GDP rank, it shows the percentile. Remember, for those who've forgotten, percentile is the percentage of countries whose rank is below yours. Okay. So for example, the current one, 94% on the extreme right, means 94% of the countries in the world are below your rank. So you are in the top 5-6%. Okay, that's the interpretation. And you can see, you can either, if you take the linear trend or this non-linear trend, we have gradually improved our ranking in the world. And see that lost decade. So come down here, if you can see this arrow, there's a period here from 2004 to 2013 or so, when there is no improvement in our relative rank. It just keeps going up and down. This is the reason why we call it a lost decade. Okay, not that growth didn't accelerate, growth accelerated, but it was not due to things which were being done during that period. So this is a very important graph which people should remember. Of course, there are fluctuations. You can see this 80%. This is the COVID period. So there was a sharp decline in COVID, but we have recovered since then and moved back up to something which is almost the highest we have been. So finally, I think I will, well, we have some time. Okay, so general lessons of reforms. These are 7 lessons which I have learned, in my, I don't know, 25 years of reform. I often tell people I am 75 years old, where many of my listeners were not even born when I started work. But so these are the general lessons, not the specific ones. I have given some earlier. So goals have to be clear. Path has to be flexible. So you must have a roadmap or a concept or where you want to go. It is not important to stick to that exact road. If something knocks you off, go off and come back. Okay, this is a very important lesson. You must be clear, because domestic and global environment keeps changing. Shocks happen. This is nothing, nothing embarrassing to move off a little bit. When you're pushed to this side or that side, it will happen. But be clear about your path, focus on it, and come back to the path. This is the most important lessons I have learned in my roughly half a century of reforms. Range of policy reform options have to be created. Okay, we may think everybody, if you take a poll of, we have 1.4 billion people, everybody has a reform. Okay, but you cannot do 100 things. Okay, so you have to create a range of options which are suitable or relevant to that path you outline. Okay, that does not mean you don't do anything else. Okay, an opportunity might arise, so you do something, but the more range and analysis you create, the better the reform will be, the quality of the outcome. You need a multi-level team effort. I have told you what my experience was in the finance ministry. I've used those, but it can be any teams. I'm using that as an example. The PM was important for his own reasons. FM was important. The finance secretary or the secretary DA was important. And professionals like me were important. We all played our own role in this effort. Okay, so each, I think it's unfair, for example, to credit a finance minister for the role which the prime minister played. On the other hand, the finance minister clearly was the most important person for all the issues which came under the purview of the finance ministry. And I have given you some of those. Those were the issues I was personally involved in, so I know. So that is what the finance minister of that time deserves full credit for all those related, I told you, financial sector, etc., tariffs, customs, all those, in a sense, were under his purview. The fourth point, crisis and an opportunity for reform. This is what we used to say in 91, but it happened in 1980 also, and it happened in 2020. The crisis, COVID crisis, were not allowed to go to waste. There were a number of reforms I've given you a flavor. So crisis is an opportunity for reform. But this happens if you are prepared, because you can't suddenly prepare a whole table of reforms if you've not thought through, for the reasons I just told you earlier. Comprehensive versus, this is a kind of a new issue, not an old issue in a new guise. And part of the reasons is social media. If you do, often it was thought reform by stealth is a word which was used for us in the 1990s. You could think of that as incremental reform. But incremental reform these days, there's social media. Everything is dissected, and income reform. Every reform you do has some opponent. Okay, so but if you do a small amount or incrementally rather than comprehensive means that positives and negatives offset each other. The people who gain and lose offset each other. But in incremental reform, given social media, only the negatives come out. So this is something we must remember. My own thought on this is that comprehensive reform, whenever possible, is actually will meet less resistance because of this balancing effect. And finally, I repeat for the third or fourth time, sustaining high growth is as difficult as raising it. So we've raised our growth rate 2-3 levels. But if I examine the experience of reforms and growth all across the world, the countries which have moved from low to middle to high income countries are those which sustain the growth for a long time. So this is again something which seems difficult for people to understand. They think, okay, we've done 6, now we'll do 7. If we have done 7 for 5 years, now we'll do 8. If we do 8, we'll do 9. That is not how it's worked in the world. I'm not saying it's impossible, but we have seen repeatedly that because of shocks which happen, the uncertainty, sustaining high growth, say at a level of 7%, is actually as challenging as what it was to raise it from 6 to 7. Okay, so what does it mean? There are a whole bunch of reforms. I'm not going to go through each one of them, but I've just listed that because my talk would be incomplete. That I say, well, you've got to sustain growth through reforms. Here are some of them. And then there are other aspects which relate to drivers of inclusion, etc., which will be important for the future. What are the kind of tax reform needed, other reforms, etc. I just try to give a flavor to make this statement more concrete. The last statement, sorry, what is it? Oops. Yeah. So sustaining high growth. So with that, let me end by saying that I have been extremely lucky in my life to do what I have always wanted, which was to reform economic policy in India and take it to a faster growth. And as I mentioned, I am extremely grateful to Dr. Manmohan Singh, who hired me and who kind of started me on this journey and made this possible. Thank you.
Thank you very, very, very much, sir. I think 1 hour is not enough to understand the transformation and as well as the lessons. Of course, you summarized your journey. Sir, I had just one question.
Mhm.
I hope I can speak on behalf of the audience as well. So right now, if I am right, the production sector, the manufacturing sector has slackened a bit. What is your opinion about it, sir? As well as trade deficit.
Yeah, just a minute. Sorry, I want to shut this off. Yeah, is the screen gone? I'm just going to shut.
No, sir, it's visible.
Okay, I'll just shut this. No, ये निकाल दो ना इसको. Okay. No, leave that. Okay. Yeah, I have tried to shut it off, but I'm not sure whether it's shut off. Okay. Can you see me or just seeing the screen?
You're visible. Your screen is also visible, sir.
Okay. Oh, ये क्या कर? Just leave it now. Okay. So yeah. So now we are, the journey I have given you is a very long-term one, right? Now we are coming down to the short term, which is going to be which is a talk in itself. Maybe at some point I'll come and I'll give it to your university also, and physically in Bangalore. But see, the way I look at it is 2 or 3 principles. First is that we are, if we look at it in this long-term context, we are at a reasonably good place to capture the new opportunities. Okay, So what are these new opportunities? One of the most important, which we missed in all this history which I have given you, is the supply chains, the FDI and anchor investors connected to supply chains. It is one thing to say just FDI should come or we should export. But the key driver of growth in Southeast Asia was these anchor investors coming and setting up a supply chain. Okay, it was not just a one-time thing. That's the key part which we missed in the earlier reforms. Okay, but now we have the opportunity, last opportunity, and we are trying to grab it. But it is a joint effort. You need the effort of the central government and every state government. The state governments which are keenly and eagerly accepting and welcoming these are doing well. So I'm talking about manufacturing actually. So that is one aspect of it. The second aspect is the demographics. The demographic aspect is that, again, the demography is very poor for the developed countries, for our competitors, China, etc. Ours is the only country where the working population ratio is rising. So the issue, the challenge is to convert the weaknesses into opportunity. The labor force participation rate, female, we all know, is very low. But it's not just a challenge, it's an opportunity, because that is how the actual labor force can increase easily. Otherwise, it would have not been possible. We know that the male labor force is actually very high, so there's no chance. So it actually may fall. So this is both a challenge and an opportunity. Similarly, the quality of basic education. Again, I've done a lot of work on this. But one way to say is, we are so far behind the other upper middle income high. The other is to say, here is an opportunity. If we can raise it from this level to this level to this level, we will become an upper middle income country, right? So look at every challenge as an opportunity and how to transform that. So that is some of the things I do currently, is try to see what else can be done. Again, lots of programs, but what is it? How to make it happen on the ground everywhere? So similarly, skilling. Our skilling system is not up to the standards of even the countries at the same per capita level of GDP, what it should be. So again, huge challenge, huge opportunity. If we can raise that skilling level, we will get a boom in growth for the next 10, 15 years. So instead of focusing on the short-term fluctuation, where I can just mention to you again, my forecast was 7%. I have recently, 3 days ago, in an interview, changed it from 6.7%. And that partly answers your question. Why? Why did I change it? Because I did not anticipate the indirect effects of the huge uncertainty which has been created by, we won't talk about individuals, but say the US elections. You all know what that means. The China, the way they are managing their economy by just going on investing. Again, this is socialism. It is not market economy. Their capacity utilization keeps going down, but the investment keeps going up. That's the opposite of market economy. Okay, if anybody needed proof, now they have it. So what does that mean? You keep investing, you keep raising capacity, but there is no demand, so you dump. So some of both these effects I had anticipated, but I must admit that they have turned out to be much more risk creating, risk aversion, and the indirect effect. So if something happens, the US effect on EU and us, something happens in the US effect on somebody else and us, right? These indirect. So I would say that is the main issue. As these uncertainties subside and as we deal with them, I have no doubt that the growth will pick up.
Yes, sir. Most of the audience today we have, I think, are the recipients of the changes which India has gone through. I was at the cusp of it, considering my age. So we've read a lot about great men and their actions. But today we've had an opportunity where we listen to you, interact with you, and we are extremely honored and thankful for spending your time, sir. The lessons that you shared personally about the reforms, and especially one line of yours struck to me. These reforms have to be pursued with rigor, and we no more can rely on the laurels, as well as sustained efforts are required. So this was a very key takeaway, I think, professionally as well as personally too. I thank the management for giving us this space, opportunity to have men of your stature to be here. We hope to see you in person, sir, in the university one of these days.
Yes.
Thank Dr. Rishikesh, who actually organized this session for all of us. So thank you once again, sir, immensely. Have a great health. Have a great day, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you to all the audience who joined us.